Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to week 6 and lecture 15 of the NPTEL MOOCs course on economic growth and development. We have so far looked at the central issues surrounding the study of economic growth, how economists have theorized about economic growth, what are the basic models of economic growth, and we've also looked at some of the debates and arguments that the growth strategists have put vis-a-vis the development strategists. Starting today's class, we will enter into the domain of what we have come to know as human development. And the discourse of human development has grown enormously over the period of last 2 decades, 2.5 decades. And so much so that there are human development by itself has become an interdisciplinary study. But the roots of some of the concepts and theories that surround the concept of human development are still grounded in the discipline of economics, and therefore any discussion on economic growth is incomplete without taking into consideration the discussion about human development. One of the central emphasis of this discourse or paradigm of human development is on putting people first, and not just on national incomes, overlooking the distributive aspects of national incomes. In this class, we will have 2 parts. In the first part of this class, I will discuss some of the frameworks that need to be kept in mind when we study the issue of development or when we negotiate with the concept of development, because development means different things to different people. And because it means different things to different people, different policy analysts or development analysts also will take different frameworks to frame different kinds of policies on human development. So in the first part of today's class, we will look at how frameworks matter, what are these different frameworks that we are talking about, and in this first part, we'll also take a look at one of the case studies. We will understand frameworks with the help of a case study from China. In the second part of today's lecture, we will see how the human development theorists or human development analysts have dealt with some of the assumptions of growth economists, and how the experiences of the developing countries over the past 25 years or so has dispelled these assumptions, and rightly so. So in the second part, we will look at what are these assumptions and how and why these assumptions have been dispelled over a period of time. When we look at frameworks, there are generally 3 frameworks or approaches to human development that we consider, and this has been worked out from a very long time. The approaches are normative approach, a positive approach, and a predictive approach, and these 3 are the different frameworks within which different development policies are framed. Now, as I've already said, development as we have come to know today means different things to different people. For some, development means sustained increases in standards of living, or increases in the amount of assets that an individual has access to. For some others, it may mean liberation from oppression, and while many others look at the modern term of development as a form of neocolonialism and actually go to the extent of despising it or rejecting it. Now, so development is basically a holistic project which takes into consideration social, political, economic and spiritual development. Often you might have heard of development of a child or development of a software. So, which basically means that development is an unfinished agenda and something that needs to be completed. So, essentially this term development is ambiguous and is quite value laden, and therefore it legitimately involves various kinds of analysis. Uh, and based upon this understanding of how development is multifaceted, we come up with, we posit these three different frameworks that I have just shown you on the slide: the normative framework, positive framework, and the predictive framework. The normative framework falls within the domain of what is called value judgments, or something which has an ethical standpoint. Now, development policies or public policies are considered to be normative when they are based on value judgments. So, in other words, we are asking questions such as, should public policy aim at increasing economic growth only, or should it give equal consideration to providing people free access to education? And such questions involve value judgments about what should be done. The policy makers, the development analysts need to have a very ethical standpoint with regard to what economic policy needs to be adopted at a given point of time. But often development also requires experience from the past. So, which means that, as we have seen in the last few classes, I have taken a lot of reference to empirical studies and how the data analysis based upon these empirical studies give us certain conclusions or conclusive evidence as to how growth or development needs to be formulated. So, often there is a need to learn from past experiences and analyze the present data. So, this falls under the domain of what we generally know as data analysis, hypothesis testing, or various kinds of descriptive analysis of a given body of data. So, we are asking the question, what is it, what exists, or what is it that we are trying to solve here? And this is a very positive approach or a scientific approach to looking at development. Now, policymakers often also need to predict how a situation could change in certain ways. For example, a development analyst might ask the question that given how many poor households exist in a country, if there is a 5% rise in economic growth over a period of time, then how many people living below the poverty line will come down, or what will be the amount of decline in the number of people living below the poverty line. Now, such kinds of questions require a predictive analysis. And social scientists and economists often enter into predictive analysis to be able to come up with some kind of picture of the future. Ecological economists, climatologists often enter into these kinds of predictive analysis to be able to plan for the future depending upon the resources that is available in hand today. So, these three frameworks, normative frameworks, positive framework, and predictive frameworks, they basically ask distinct questions. But these questions may also be interconnected. There is no reason for them to be disparate from each other. So, what essentially happens in the case of development analysis is that one needs to have a positive and a predictive analysis to be able to consider or identify the normative framework within which these analyses can be implemented, and vice versa. Often we begin with a normative analysis or a normative framework and then move on to positive and predictive frameworks. Now, let me take an example. Suppose you must have heard of infrastructure projects taking place, being implemented in different parts of the country. And suppose a certain bridge needs to be conducted in a certain locality, and a lot of consumer or individual information needs to be collected for deciding whether and how the bridge needs to be conducted. So, in this case, what policy makers are doing is they are collecting a lot of data with regard to the individual's tastes and preferences, whether they are willing to pay for a certain bridge, or whether the government will have to pay for the infrastructure cost. And based upon the data that has been collected from the locality, a decision is taken regarding how the bridge needs to be constructed and who will be the users, whether a tax need to be collected from the people who are users of this infrastructure project and so on and so forth. And here what we are doing is a positive analysis. So based upon a positive analysis, we are deciding whether or not to go ahead with a certain infrastructure project. But if we take an example of how the beginning point is a normative framework, if you take the example of affirmative action that is taken in different parts of the country, or the policy of reservation that is carried out in India, for example, you would see that it starts from the basic premise of or the objective of promoting social justice. And based upon the premise of social justice, there are certain social, political and economic policies that are formulated with regard to what are the benefits that will be derived by different sections of the population, what are the benefits that will be derived by the vulnerable sections of the population or the marginalized sections of the population. So in this case, we are beginning with a normative analysis first and then moving on to do a positive. We are utilizing a positive framework because we are deciding what are the benefits, what are the economic benefits that should go to these marginalized sections of the population. Also, if I have to take another example, sometimes for describing the severity of poverty in a country, it is essential to describe the severity of a poverty of a country, because when we are conceptualizing the concept of development, what we are essentially doing here is to look at the improvements in the quality of life of people, and of course poverty is one of the biggest obstacle for improvement of the quality of life of people. So here one needs to make a value judgment about how poverty is to be conceptualized. If poverty is conceptualized only as lack of incomes, then obviously a different kind of an economic policy needs to be formulated. However, if poverty is conceptualized as having unmet basic needs, then a different kind of a economic policy needs to be formulated. So the point I am trying to make here is that normative approach or normative frameworks are central to the shaping of development policies, but of course it is not sufficient to create it, and therefore normative frameworks matter a lot. And there are certain core issues when we are looking at normative recommendations for development, because there is an uncertainty of difficulty in prediction about whether or not an economic policy need to be taken up, because we do not know, because the future is uncertain. So if we are trying to take up a certain financial policy today, we do not know how the markets are going to react in the future. So there is always a trade-off with regard to development policies being carried out. Similarly, if we are asking questions, how can one take action on climate change? Whether we should have more of solar energy or wind energy or nuclear energy. These are questions that we do not know which energy policy will be the best option because there is a lot of uncertainty about the future. Now, in addition to uncertainty, trade-offs are also more or less the norm than an exception in the context of development policy. For example, in yesterday's class on the general lecture on whether to follow a growth-mediated security strategy of development or a support-led security strategy of development, we were dealing with this dilemma of which strategy will have or will make greater demands on the national incomes of the country. Similarly, we can ask questions like, should farmers in India be encouraged to produce BT cotton or biofuels for the supermarkets or for the European supermarkets? Now, the trade-off here is that while it does create employment for some farmers in India, it also has the trade-off of shifting of agricultural land from production of food crops to non-food crops, and which gives rise to a situation of food insecurity within the country. It may also give rise to various kinds of carbon emissions, and are we as a developing country ready to bear the costs of economic development of the so-called developed countries. Similarly, we can ask questions as to should the Ministry of Human Resource Development of India invest more on primary education, secondary education or higher education. So essentially what I am meaning to say here is that policy making often involves trade-offs between the pursuit of two valuable objectives. Now, there is another difficulty for policy making, and that is that there are deep interconnections between different kinds of policies. As I was just taking the example of biofuels or production of goods for the European supermarkets. Now, while on the one hand, while on the one hand the objective is to create incomes within the country, the trade-off also is that we are creating a situation of food insecurity probably by diverting agricultural land from the production of food crops to non-food crops. So, it is essential that policies navigate between different contexts, whether they are political, social, economic or cultural. And therefore, development is a complex process, it's a complex phenomenon, and ideas about what development should be, it matters. But different ways of understanding what development should improve lead to different policies and consequences. And so economic and social trade-offs, they give us ample reason to believe that normative frameworks matter. Now, to take the discussion of frameworks ahead, let us discuss case study which had been in the news in the middle of 2000s, around 2004, 2005, when there was a lot of discussion regarding green GDP calculations in China. And I have taken reference to this in one of my earlier classes when I was looking at the economic indices of development, and we looked into the concept of green GDP. So, I have chosen to look up the case study with regard to China, in which a certain lake was polluted, and what are the questions that this kind of a pollution that gives rise to. So, let us first have a look at a small video on this pollution of this lake Taihu in the Wuxi province of China, and then we will look at some of the questions here. So let me summarize this small video for you. The state of Taihu Lake basically epitomizes China's development process in the past 3 decades. This lake is located in the prefecture of Wuxi, which is China's most prosperous industrial towns, and is also home to the country's third largest freshwater lake, which is the Taihu Lake. It is 90 miles west of Shanghai, and it has been a source of life for millions of people. In 2007, it was estimated that there were more than 20,000 chemical factories around the lake river basin. And the lake is also located within a region that has experienced the highest level of urbanization in China. And consider the fact here that over the period of last 3 decades, starting from the period of the 1980s, China has seen an unprecedented rise in their growth rates in national incomes. And this has been topic of our discussion in the last few classes when I discussed Branko Milanovic's paper about how the Chinese growth rate alone was sufficient to bring down the world inequality rates over a period of 1980 to about 1998. Now, the population density of the Tai Lake or the Taihu Lake area exceeds 1,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. Large amounts of industrial waste, urban sewage and chemical fertilizers end up in the lake water, causing water eutrophication. And this leads to the formation of blue-green algae and renders the water undrinkable. And this pollution of the Lake Tai reached its highest peak in May 2007, when a large bloom of blue-green algae severely deteriorated water quality, and 2 million people were deprived of drinking water for nearly a week. The entire town was cut off from its natural water supply, and according to senior officials of the Chinese environment regulating body, as temperatures rise, large-scale outbreaks of blue-green algae may also occur in future. Now, look at some of the estimates here. Since 1998, the Chinese government from the central to the local level has pooled many efforts to treat the water pollution in this lake. By 2005, the Chinese government had pumped about 10 billion yuan into the first phase of the plan to tackle pollution of the Taihu. And the second phase budget had amounted to about 100 billion yuan. Now, we also know that for a long time now, growth in GDP has been seen as the only relevant indicator of development achievements. And according to a report by the Ministry of Environment Protection published in 2006, the cost of environmental degradation caused by water pollution amounted to 286 billion yuan in 2004, while environmental degradation caused by air pollution cost 219 billion yuan. And total pollution related losses accounted for more than 3% of aggregate local GDP. Now consider this. The opportunity cost of inaction is undoubtedly very high. In economics, we generally calculate what is the opportunity cost of an act. So, if we are acting on a certain environmental pollution that has taken place, that leads to certain monetary costs. But if we are not acting on a certain event, then what is the opportunity cost that arises because of not acting on it? What are the different costs? What are the damages that take place because of inaction? So, the opportunity cost of inaction is undoubtedly very high in this case. And not investing tackling pollution now will result greater economic losses in future. So, while China has achieved extraordinary progress in the recent years, the environmental challenges along with other kinds of challenges are likely to grow. And this calls for major shifts in China's development policies and its normative assumptions about what constitutes development. And it is in this context that we argue that normative frameworks matter, and they lead us to a certain basic to ask basic questions about certain trade-offs here between economic growth and quality of life, between policies that favor different groups of people, between the short term and the long term. So, we are asking questions such as, are poor people better off because of economic growth? On what grounds should their quality of life be assessed? Does economic expansion go hand in hand with a more limited access to safe water? Is developing more and more chemical factories in the prefecture of Wuxi in China a desirable way to generate higher income and employment? Is this the only criteria which should guide policy decisions? Is the expansion of air travel to be encouraged on the premise that its contribution to the country's economic output is necessary? How are economic benefits to offset environment and social costs? What are the economic benefits to offset environmental and social costs? And is displacement justified? In these kinds of questions, which are basically the trade-offs, we can see here two sets of questions being asked by different groups, and each relying on certain normative assumptions about what matters and what policies should be pursued. One set of question relates to how the policy decision will affect economic output. So basically the question is that how much are the chemical companies in Taihu Lake region contributing to China's economic growth, say. And the second set of questions relate to how the policy will affect people's quality of life, whether it will affect positively or negatively. In other words, we are asking the question if economic growth will enable the Chinese to live a life they value, such as living a healthy life free of contamination concerns. So this case study of the Taihu Lake here sufficiently illustrates what is considered to be development and what is seen as a policy to improve people's lives. And we also see that it is inextricably linked with values about what matters. So whether development aims to improve economic growth alone, or it should also advance human rights, human agency, or human flourishing, there are implications, and the implications are both practical and far-reaching. And this through this case study, we are trying to drive home the point that normative frameworks are very important before we get into economic growth calculations, economic growth estimates, or even before deciding what is the rate at which a country should grow. Okay, now let us get to the second part of this lecture now, in which we will look at some of the assumptions related to economic growth and how the human development analysts have dealt with these assumptions, how they have challenged these assumptions based upon the experiences of the developing countries. Some of these issues we have taken in the last few classes. For example, in the last general lecture on Dresden Sen's book on hunger and public action, we also looked at how there should be some scope for public action or public support, and how there are countries who have not waited to grow unwarrantedly, and then looked at the issues of creation of basic capabilities or basic needs for its people, whereas they have very diligently and deliberately tried to create basic capabilities of people first, and then tried to balance the idea of economic growth and development. Now let us critically examine several assumptions about economic growth and its contribution to human flourishing or development. One of the first assumption, which we have dealt earlier also, is that a high GDP per capita is necessary for human flourishing. Now the first assumption is basically saying that economic growth is desirable because it raises people's income and hence their quality of life. Now this is something that we have devoted a substantial amount of time in our last classes, in which we discussed the two strategies as I have just mentioned. So now we know that in many cases it may be true, but there is no automatic or straightforward connection between a high GDP per capita and the ability of people to flourish. So this table here illustrates the link between GDP and some dimensions of human flourishing, such as health, education, and political freedom. In the case of 6 countries, Saudi Arabia, Uruguay, Russia, Costa Rica, Vietnam, and Morocco, the indicators we have considered is GDP per capita in purchasing power parity US dollars, adult literacy rate, female literacy rate, life expectancy in years, under 5 mortality, political rights, civil liberties, and human development index. Now one of the questions that might arise in your mind is that why we have selected only these indicators, and there is a sizable literature that goes in the discourse of human development that has gone into explaining why the selection of certain indicators, and which we will come to when we are doing the human development index. But this table here, in this table we are comparing 2 countries each. We are comparing Saudi Arabia and Uruguay, Russia with Costa Rica, and Vietnam with Morocco. Now, if you see here, Uruguay has a much lower GDP per capita than Saudi Arabia. The first row, Uruguay has a GDP per capita of 9,962 US dollars in purchasing power parity, whereas Saudi Arabia has more than 15,000 in US dollars. So, Uruguay has a much lower GDP per capita than Saudi Arabia, yet people live longer in Uruguay. If you look at the life expectancy in years, the life expectancy in Uruguay is 75.9 compared to Saudi Arabia's 72.2. So, people in Uruguay live longer than they do in Saudi Arabia. Similarly, women are more literate. If you look at the female literacy rate, 97% in Uruguay compared to 76% in Saudi Arabia. Fewer children die prematurely. So, if you look at the under 5 mortality rate, it is 15 in Uruguay compared to 26 in Saudi Arabia. Political and civil rights, civil liberties are maintained far better in Uruguay than in Saudi Arabia. So, which means that people have the right to vote and the freedom of expression and association are fully respected in Uruguay than in Saudi Arabia. Similarly, if you contrast Russia with Costa Rica, you will see that Russia is wealthier, but its people live much shorter lives. The Russian GDP per capita is more than 10,000 US dollars. Costa Rica's is 9,481. But the life expectancy, there's a huge difference between the life expectancy, the number of years an average individual in Russia lives compared to that in Costa Rica, 65 versus 78.5. The political rights and civil liberties are also better maintained in Costa Rica than in Russia. The under 5 mortality rate is also much better in Costa Rica than in Russia. If you look at the two countries, Vietnam and Morocco, you will see that Morocco has a higher GDP per capita than Vietnam, but its illiteracy rates and IMR are much higher. So, the adult literacy rate in Vietnam is 90% compared to Morocco's 52%. Female literacy rate in Vietnam is 86%, more than 86% compared to Morocco's just about 40%. People live lesser in Morocco, for lesser number of years in Morocco. Life expectancy is about 70 compared to Vietnam's 73 and so on. Now, when all of these countries are arranged according to the HDI index, the Human Development Index, the last row of this table, the wealthier countries in terms of GDP per capita are not necessarily better off when human dimensions such as health and education are taken into account. Here, Saudi Arabia and Russia, the two richest countries in terms of economic development, are ultimately poorer than Uruguay and Costa Rica in terms of human development. So, this first assumption that a high GDP per capita necessarily leads to human flourishing has been sufficiently challenged by the experience of the developing countries or the empirical studies based upon these human development indicators of the past few years. Let us look at the second assumption. The second assumption is that families with a good income will not be deprived in other dimensions of development. Now, this is another widespread assumption that not being poor in terms of income means not suffering from a lack in other matters too, such as health and education. But empirical data often tell another story. Now, this is a study that was carried out by in Peru and India by Ruggieri, Sate and Stewart in 2013, and they concluded that those who were poor in terms of income were not necessarily the same people who were poor in terms of education or nutrition. So, they obtained the following results. In India, 65% of children who belong to households below the poverty line or the monetary poverty line were not educationally poor. In other words, they were enrolled in primary schools. In Peru, 93% of children belonging to monetary poor households were not enrolled were not educationally poor, and 66% were not nutritionally poor. However, 43% of children in India who did not belong to monetary poor households were not enrolled at school. If you look at the first row here, these are the percentage of people who are not income poor but are capability deprived. So, in India, 43% of children were not going to school. In Peru, 32% in spite of not being income poor were not going to school. Among the adults, 60% in India in spite of not being income poor were not going to school. In terms of nutrition, in spite of not being income poor, 53% of children were undernourished, and 21% in Peru, 63% and 55% among the adults. And of course, if we divide this category children into males and females, we'll of course find that the number of females who are deprived of nutrition in spite of not being income poor will be much higher than the males. The second row here talks about percentage of people who are not income poor but are not capability deprived. So these are 65% of children who are enrolled in schools are not income poor, and in spite of this fact are enrolled in schools. 93%, a very high percentage of children who are not income poor but they have been enrolled in schools. Similarly, if you look at the nutrition indicators here, 53% of children, they are not income poor but they are not undernourished as well, and 91% of adults here are not income poor but are also not capability deprived. So what does this mean? This means that having an income or belonging to a non-poor household does not guarantee that your basic capabilities will be intact. Your basic capabilities of being educated, or basic capabilities that arise out of being educated or being healthy will be kept intact. Because often what happens is in a country where people do have access to basic incomes or incomes are guaranteed, the public services themselves might not be functional, as a result of which children and adults may not have access to basic capabilities. A very good example of this is the number of dropouts among girl children in the rural areas of India, where both girl children from income and non-income income poor and not income poor households drop out of schools because of the absence of a very basic infrastructure of toilet facility not being available in primary schools. So the number of dropouts among girl children is very high in the rural areas of India because of the absence of basic infrastructure in schools. And this has got nothing to do with whether or not there is income, there is sufficient incomes in the households of these girl children. The third assumption that we look at is it is often said that economic growth will automatically reduce other kinds of poverty such as malnutrition. Now in recent years, India and China, they have been celebrated as an economic success, and we know that the Chinese growth rate has almost solely been responsible for bringing down the number of people living on $1 a day. So it has been assumed that sustained and high economic growth rates have had a tremendous impact on other kinds of poverty. But as the case study that we just saw has shown that very high economic growth rates have led to massive environmental damages in a particularly urbanized province of China. So it is rather counterintuitive that economic growth will automatically reduce other kinds of poverty. And without going so far, if we look at the examples from India itself, this assumption sounds like a myth, because we know that India's growth story has accelerated, particularly in the 1990s and the 2000s. And the early 2000s have been a period of very high growth rates in India. Now, in spite of India's growth experience in 1998-99, 47% of children under the age of 3 were undernourished. And in 2005-06, the number was more or less the same. You could say that the number of malnourished children under 3 was stagnated. It was about 46%, which means that even though the growth rates in India were rising, it had no effect on the number of malnourishment or the extent of malnourishment in India. So there was a distribution failure. So between 1998-99 and 2005-06, anemia among children had also risen from 75 to 79%. These figures are based upon the data collected from the National Family Health Survey. So of course, there is no automatic connection or straightforward connection. Economic growth need not necessarily reduce other kinds of poverty such as malnutrition. The fourth assumption is with regard to data for income and expenditure, and it is often said that the data for income and expenditure are better than other poverty data, and therefore it makes sense to have sophisticated analysis done on income and expenditure data. And the critics of non-monetary indicators of development argue that income and expenditure data are the most reliable indicators of development. But in fact, income and expenditure or expenditure data are subject to a number of serious and widely recognized difficulties. To begin with, income data in developing countries are often considered less accurate than consumption data and are also more volatile. So, therefore, the chances of reflecting the income estimates chances of reflecting sustained living standards is less reliable. So, for example, in a country like India, where you have a formal sector and an overwhelmingly large informal sector, where people do not have access to regular incomes and they do not pay an income tax, to expect that accurate estimates of their incomes can be collected or is being registered somewhere is an overestimation. So, income data in developing, and this is true of many developing countries of the world, where there is a very large informal sector and also the reporting of incomes is not correct. So, therefore, we cannot with a lot of confidence say that income data will definitely reflect the sustained living standards of people. The second reason which poses a challenge to this assumption is that both consumption and income data have to be generated item by item with varying recall periods, and therefore this may lead to potential errors. In India, for example, we carry out National Sample Survey Organization's household survey for consumption expenditure, and of course there is a reference period which is taken for collection of this data. And this requires that the respondent recall what is the amount of consumption that has taken place or occurred over a period of this reference period, and then report. And this recall itself leads to errors. There is no certainty that this data is absolutely reliable. The third challenge to this assumption is that a lot of consumption in the rural areas or even in the urban areas take place from non-market sources. So, not everything that is being consumed is bought from the market. People are not, because markets are inefficient, markets are not functioning properly in the context of developing countries particularly. So, not everything is bought from the market. Some of it may come from homegrown production, some of it may come from social transfers, some of it may come as in the form of benefits from various kinds of NGOs. So, it is not straightforward. So, usually in consumption expenditure surveys, what we do is we impute a market price to the amount consumed from different sources if they are not coming from market sources. And this imputation of a market price also leads to potential errors. So, the fact that much of the consumption is coming from non-market sources may also lead to errors. There are also challenges with respect to purchasing power parity rates across rural urban areas or countries. And therefore, to be able to construct an equivalent income for households of different sizes and determination of poverty lines, anybody who is conversant with the idea of poverty lines and who has seen how poverty lines are calculated, estimated, and how it has a problem of pegging it to certain year in a country, knows that how difficult it is to come up with a poverty line which is applicable to different regions within a country. For example, in India, every state has a different poverty line, and because of the amount of data required to be able to come up with a more representative poverty line, it is not updated annually. So, there is a lot of time lag with respect to the estimates that come up based upon these poverty line, and this is one of serious challenge with respect to this assumption that data on income and expenditure are better than other poverty data. One of the things that has happened, particularly with the progress of the human development discourse or the human development paradigm in the last 20 years or so, is that the coverage and quality of non-monetary data has improved in the last 2 decades. So, today we have a lot of nutrition indicators which was not available in the 1970s or the 1980s. We have a lot of education data which is available. We have a lot of data on political and civil rights that is available, but was not available earlier. So, there is a lot of non-monetary data which has come up and which can sufficiently reflect on the state of development of individuals and regions within a country. And additionally, regularized household surveys in developing countries have increased steadily since the 1980s. And when I was in the class on inequality, when we were discussing Branko Milanovic's paper on does the world have a middle class, and we were analyzing the world inequality vis-a-vis inequality within countries of different countries, within countries, we made reference to the fact that because household surveys on income and expenditure is increasingly being available since the 1980s, it has now become possible to have a more representative indicator than just looking at average GDP growth rate or just GDP per capita within a country. So, because of the regularized household surveys in developing countries, the data quality with regard to various aspects of development are now available, and that pose a serious challenge to the assumption that data for income and expenditure are better than other poverty data. And one of the last points within this assumption also is that a number of efforts to strengthen the capacities of national statistical offices have led to an increase in sample and data quality. And in fact, I would urge you to go to the website of the Human Resource Development Office of the UNDP to be able to see the amount of data that has been collected based upon the human development indicators. Another assumption is that it is easier to promote economic growth than human flourishing, because it is easy to see how incomes move over a period of time. The focus should be on promoting economic growth than on other important indicators of human development. To this assumption, the research coming from the World Bank itself busts this assumption that it is not so. A classic paper on the lost decades developing countries stagnation in spite of policy reform 1980 to 1998, which appeared in the Journal of Economic Growth and was written by William Easterly, very succinctly points out the failure of the Washington Consensus and how, in spite of the economic reforms process, growth seems to have stagnated and rather deteriorated while it should have increased. So, to quote from his journal paper, between the period 1980 to 1998, median per capita income growth in developing countries was 0% as compared to 2.5% between the period 60 to 79. And yet, policies like financial depth and real overvaluation and initial conditions like health, education, fertility and infrastructure generally improved from 60 to 79 to 80 to 98. So, developing country growth should have increased instead of decreased according to the standard growth regression determinants of growth, and this stagnation seems to represent a disappointing outcome to the movement towards the Washington Consensus by developing countries. A similar report brought out by World Bank in 2005 titled Economic Growth in the 1990s, Learning from a Decade of Reform, they observed that growth performance was uneven across developing countries and lower than anticipated. And in fact, even long back in 1989, with the publication of Hunger and Public Action, where we have already seen that how countries have been able to provide basic needs to its people in spite of not registering very high rates of economic growth. So, the point is that although policymakers in the 1980s and 90s had thought that the determinants of growth were very clear, that macroeconomic stability, trade liberalization, privatization, deregulation, financial liberation and better public sector governance are the determinants of economic growth, but economic growth seemed to have proved elusive, in the words of William Easterly, for a majority of developing countries. The last assumption is with regard to that economic growth can be sustained without considerations for human flourishing, and this is one of the important arguments put forward by the growth Puritans, who say that economic growth is more desirable because it can be sustained, and we need not give much importance to human development indicators. But experience has shown us that countries that have been able to sustain growth were those that had previously invested in health and education of its people. For example, South Korea, that we had discussed in yesterday's class, even Kuwait, that had invested a lot in its people before going on to maintain very high rates of growth. And of course, it is we know that education and health are instrumental in promoting economic growth. So, to end today's class, human flourishing and impact of policies on people's lives are the fundamental concerns of human development, This whole discourse and paradigm of human development puts people first, and when we are trying to conceptualize a development policy, or even when we are trying to conceptualize the very concept of development, there are certain questions that should come to our mind. We should ask ourselves the question, what do we understand by the term development? We should draw a picture of our own conception of development, and we should look at what are the normative frameworks within which our conceptualization of development fits, and then we can go on to discuss to understand what are the main ideas and concepts that guide public policies in our own country to begin with. So, to sum up, this was an introductory class on human development, in which it is important to understand why normative frameworks matter, and how the human development paradigm has diverged or created a niche for itself by questioning the determinants of growth and questioning the normative framework within which economic growth was analyzed, and why it is important to look at different kinds of normative frameworks and then decide what policies should be framed accordingly. In the next class, we will look at the connections between human development and capability approach. We will try to see what are the basic concepts that surround this concept of capability approach, which is at the root of the progress of the idea of human development. Thank you.